We'll start a little early. Start on time, end on time. Remember that. We're actually going to start early, end early. So start with introductions, and I think what we should do is start with the newbies at the table. So you want to go first?
Right here. So I'm Kristen Lenhart. I'm the acting Deputy State Director for Resources. So Buddy Green, and then it was Lori Armstrong. So she right now is our acting Associate State Director, so I'm filling in for her for the next 4 months.
Okay, welcome. Joy?
Joy Bannon, Wyoming Wildlife Federation.
Keith?
Keith Fulton, White Hawk.
Julie Lutz, Genesis Alpha Life.
Dave Pellets, and Basin Associations.
Brian Jensen, NRCS.
John Espy, Carbon County Commissioner.
I'm Bob Budd with Wyoming Wildlife Natural Resource Trust.
Joe Scott, Oil and Gas Commission.
Tyler Allen, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Newbie. Chris Wickman, Wyoming Department of Ag.
Sort.
Kind of, sort of.
Brian Rutledge, Jollybush.
Okay, start over Wayno.
Wayne Cotton, Game and Fish IT.
Samuel Jackson, Game Fish IT.
Megan Lockwood, Game and Fish.
Amanda Monroe, Game and Fish. Anita Mahoney, Game and Fish.
Nicholas Graff, University of Wyoming, Wakisk.
Dave.
Dave Applegate, Occidental Petroleum.
Esther Wagner, Petroleum Association of Wyoming.
Nick Owens, Noble Energy.
Kirsty Lawson, Grass Mountain Environmental Consultants.
Greg Sharp, Grass Mountain.
Michael Barr, Bedrock Performance Minerals.
Leslie Schreiber, Game and Fish.
Jenny Marsland, BLM.
Russell Tate, Intermountain Resources.
Who we got over here? Got this.
Miss Whipper, Game and Fish. Jen Wade, Tri-Hydro Corporation.
Michelle Thornhill.
Scott Camper, TRC.
Richard Garrett, Nature Conservancy.
Janelle Gonzalez, BLM.
Okay, thank you all for being here. We will have a fairly light turnout today. I think everybody is worn out from all of the previous meetings and getting the executive order done, so we will probably be done fairly early, unless Kristen or others talk a lot, which I've seen happen. So
Right.
yeah,
No guarantees.
That's why I'm sitting here where I can stare at it.
Right, yeah. Cut it
Right.
off.
The first thing on the agenda is the LECDAT overview, and Leslie and I talked. I wanted her to give a fairly in-depth presentation on this so that people can understand it. As you know, we had all kinds of gloom and doom back in, April, and Leslie's gone through all that, and I think that I'd also encourage people to ask questions as about all of the stuff that she presents, but Leslie, it's all yours. So.
Okay. Pull that up, Wayne. I have a graph. All right, so the main the number of active and inactive leks. So this gives an average of males over time, but you also kind of need to know how many leks are active versus inactive, or else this is, yeah.
Can you define those terms real quick for me?
It's harder to reach inactive. You have to go out at least one season, know exactly where the lek is, look for sun, not seeing birds, then you can call it inactive. Or you can go out twice during the ideal time, not seeing birds, and call it inactive. If you don't go out at all, it's unknown. So
Leslie, just to remind people, let's walk through the whole range of classifications of leks. So you have active and inactive. You have abandoned, and do you want to just go through all of that?
So yes. So we have an annual status. So for 1 year, a lek can be called either active, inactive, or unknown. And abandoned can be, we'll get to abandoned in a second. So those are the three that can be for that 1 year. For the management status, we're looking over a longer time frame. For the management status, it can be occupied, unoccupied, or undetermined. Occupied leks, birds or birds have been there. Unoccupied leks, over a 10-year period, at least 4 of those years have been inactive, and there have been no birds seen or signs seen there. Undetermined is we don't have enough information to call it occupied or unoccupied. And so to become unoccupied, a lek can either be abandoned or it can be destroyed. Maybe whatever, something happens and the lek's destroyed. So those are 2 terms that can create an unoccupied management status.
Okay. Everybody got the term. The reason I had asked her to do that is those terms get misused quite often in the popular press, and they carry connotation. If it says it's unoccupied, that it's abandoned. It's not. It's just not occupied at that point. It may be, but it isn't necessarily. And so in my dealings with the media in the last few months, it's been real frustrating to try and explain that doesn't mean what you think it means. If it's inactive in 1 year, it doesn't mean it's abandoned. It doesn't mean it's unoccupied.
Right.
Yeah.
Just because a lek is inactive for 1 year doesn't make the lek unoccupied for management purposes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And is there a minimum number for the threshold to be active?
So at least 2 males.
2 males?
Yeah. Displaying males. So the percentage of active versus inactive leks, we'd also look at this on an annual basis because this is an average over time. So in 2017 and 2018, sorry, I don't have a graph for this. 2017 and 2018, 80% of the leks were active, 20% of the leks were inactive for that year, for each year.
Is that percent of occupied leks?
Correct.
Okay.
In 2019, so for this year, 79% of occupied leks were active, 21% of occupied leks were inactive. So it moved 1%. Okay, so Wayne, can you go down to the next slide? So I also put this graph up just to have full disclosure about our entire lek data set. This is here we are in 2019. The previous graph went to the mid-1990s. We have data of poor quality, I would say, going back all the way to 1960, 1950. Just be aware that during these years, there was no standardized way to collect lek data. People thought, hey, it's really cool, these birds are out there, we're gonna go count these big leks. And so that can create bias in the 60s and 70s because they were only counting large leks. It wasn't a standardized, they did not count 87% of non-occupied leks back then. So that's all I have for a presentation. I happy for questions, yeah.
A question, that's the statewide trend, but do we see the entire state kind of follow that trend, or can there be regional discrepancies where you actually see one part of the state where it may be going up, but the majority of the state going down? So it would still reflect a downward trend, but do we see regional differences around the state with these or not?
So I looked at that. There are 8 local working group areas in the state, and I looked at those per local working group area. All of them were decreasing.
But historically, is that true? Or do we know?
Yeah, I think that, and Tom, you can help, but in general, yes, that has been true. When they're down, they're down. When they're up, and they all tend to reflect the same. I don't know, Leslie, that's also true pretty much range-wide most years, is it not?
From what I'm hearing, it's everybody's down. Everybody's down, we're all down. I haven't been around long enough to know if everybody's up, we're all up.
It's generally true, there are exceptions.
Anomalies, yeah. So I've got a couple questions just based on being in the field all spring. I know around Casper that one of the observations was that the birds were lekking considerably later, probably due to the snowfall and other things. Do you have concerns that when that kind of behavioral difference occurs, that you're not getting peak counts, or that you're undercounting or overcounting or anything like that? And will you talk a little bit about how that seasonality affects what you do? Because you're pretty hardwired to do your counts roughly the same time. And what she said was that, they were lekking strong at the end of April, 1st of May, which was unusual. You want to talk a little bit about those kind of anomalies?
Yeah, so our official count period starts on April 1st and it goes to May 7th, to try to include the range of when birds attend leks. So yes, birds, I've heard that from multiple areas, especially in the southern third of the state where we had those blizzards go through repeatedly, that people were seeing males attend leks strongly later in April. Just anecdotally, from what I've heard and what I've seen from the data, is that people went out and did their lek counts later in April because they couldn't get to the lek early because of the snow. So there is a mild, very mild question mark in my mind of did we get the actual peak male count because of just poor access and the change in timing of the birds. However, I think that the effort was consistent enough that if there is a change, it'll be very slight.
And it may be very localized, one lek or another. And then time also factors that. As you average it over time, it may be high or low at any given time. Is that fair?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, year to year, maybe early one year, late the next year.
Sure.
You're gonna. It's
sure, and that's why we have a range of days to go do counts. In addition to counts, people can do surveys, so that, and that's a much wider time frame where you're not necessarily trying to get the peak count, you're just trying to see if the lek is active or not. And if there's birds there, you can count. So we also have that information kind of feeding into this of that wider time frame that's available.
okay. Other questions? Yeah, Larry.
Has there been any attempt to try to describe why these fluctuations? Because I just look back, and so Carbon County and Sweetwater County, when I look back, when I look at those, when we start to see the big troughs and the declines correspond with 2002 is one of the driest years on record, 2012 shattered 2002, 2018, and so each one of those troughs corresponds with pretty severe drought conditions, at least in Carbon and Sweetwater County. So is that the driver here, or is it something else? Or have we even tried to look at that?
So multiple researchers have tried to look at the cycle of sage grouse populations with varying results, I would say, with varying results. I would say that that's a topic of study that has just kind of barely scratched the surface and could use more in-depth study. Many wildlife populations fluctuate up and down, and for these fluctuations to be synchronous across the range and across the state, it makes kind of good sense that this is some sort of larger, maybe climatic driver of the fluctuations. We can use the word cycle. There have been studies saying that yes, sage-grouse populations do cycle. I've heard rebuttals against that study, saying that we don't have a long enough data set to know if they cycle or not. The gold standard for cycling wildlife populations is kind of snowshoe hare and lynx, where they have 100 years worth of fur trapping records, and they can predict the cycle. I'm not going to predict sage-grouse populations, and we don't have 100 years worth of data. However, from the studies that are coming out, they are trying to get at what you just said. What are they cycling? Number one, what are the years? What is the periodicity of that cycle, and what is causing it? It's a very complex issue. I would say that as a manager, if the peaks and the troughs of the cycle get lower, then to me that indicates a drop in carrying capacity.
We did have a presentation, geez, what, 3 years ago at BLM in Cheyenne by
Pacific Ocean.
somebody who was tying it all to El Nino. But I think at the end of the day, after that presentation, it's kind of one of those real easy to go backward and fit a curve over the top of something and then blame that for it. I don't know that there was any direct link between the two other than circumstantial, but did
we've
you have
heard everything from from jackrabbits
Yeah.
to the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah. Tom, you had something?
Just that it gets hard with the people that have looked at the weather data and looked at precipitation data and tried to base that on seasonal precipitation. The timing of precipitation is so important. If it comes as you guys are ranchers, know that you could have normal precipitation every year, but if it falls at the wrong time, it's not going to be a big grass year. So the same thing's going on with grouse. Looking at the data, it's hard to do but that doesn't mean the climate isn't driving this whole thing and weather isn't driving this whole thing, but teasing out those specifics of the timing of it has proven difficult for people.
Yeah.
Well, in predicting what El Nino is going to do or not do, is it equally?
Well, I think to Tom's point, the lek counts on our ranch out of Rollins were actually up this year. But last year, the precipitation, what we did, hit at the perfect time. Where down where my brother is, in the Little Snake River Valley, they didn't see anything. But we had a decent grass year last year, in comparison to most all of our neighbors. So our lek counts, I went through them, and they were actually just up just a tick from last year. So, you get so microed on this that you can't look at it, you start bringing out the whole cycle of things.
Yeah.
I think her point is really important, looking at where our peaks go and understanding that that's sort of the limit we're capping out at. And that's why we keep talking about reclamation, restoration, habitat improvement, because unless we can raise those peaks, those valleys don't do so good.
Yeah, Leslie and I had a conversation when the data came out, and I think that, and you've probably seen it said by numerous people, it is a concern. Anytime that you're in a downward trend, it's a concern. But there's nothing that's out of the normal range of variability here. I think we'll learn a lot this fall when we get your winged data. And then they've been really good, the department has, at advising and predicting as to where we think we'll end up, in subsequent years. It doesn't always play out that way. But I guess the message, Leslie, that you've given me is, it's nothing to be alarmed at, but it is something to be concerned about anytime we're in a downward trend. And it isn't just sage grouse, I'll tell you that. I've just spent 2 days in the Wyoming range, and we're looking at similar trends with other species, and what it's tied to, we aren't sure. But certainly, weather and climate have an impact.
I think there's 2 places here to take comfort in the fact we didn't hit those 96 numbers, as we talked about early on this year, that we could be as low as we've ever been the way things were looking. And the other thing is, Idaho just took a 52% hit.
Yeah.
That's a hell of a lot different than the performance here. Now, how that relates, you know, best guesses all around the table, but it's a serious issue for Idaho. And we should be going, okay, in my opinion, doubling down, figuring out what we can do, this is the best we can do to raise those peaks.
Other questions, thoughts? Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you had any lagging more for small mammal data for this area to overlay on this and see the troughs and valleys?
We have history. Tom actually
Yeah,
did a
that's been-
paper.
Well, I didn't do it, but there's been a paper exactly on that using cottontail rabbit harvest, and they're doing the exact same thing. I don't know what the last 2 years happened, but my observations would certainly mimic that. I'm not seeing too many bunnies right now.
Because when there's not a lot of rabbits, the predators have to eat some.
Yeah.
Well, it's not, but I don't want to go down too far that quote rabbit hole, sorry. But there is no, they're doing the same thing at the same time. If they were actually switching, you'd have a delay. The rabbits would go down, and then a couple of years later, the sage grouse, being the target of those predators, would go down. They're doing the same thing at the same time, so the same, whatever is driving is doing the same thing at the same time. It's not a predator switching thing.
Because we're seeing a huge decline since 2016 of rabbit populations.
Yeah, which would follow the trend. I can tell you, most of them have moved to Cheyenne, and they're living in the neighborhood. I don't know how they got there, but small, probably a Volkswagen Rabbit, but, yeah. Anything else, Leslie, or any other questions for Leslie? Thank you. So the next topic is moving forward with the development of the handbooks and manuals for the new SGEO. Let me back up and throw something in here before we get to that. We have not met since the executive order was adopted. Just a very short version of that process, or the finalization of that process, and then if you have comments or questions, it'd probably be appropriate to do that today. As you'll recall, in Lander, we said we went through several iterations and several different opportunities to comment on the new executive order. That meeting was the final one before it was basically all those comments were taken in, and we went through then with a fairly fine-tooth comb, adjusted where we had to make adjustments. You probably saw in WildFile that one of them, that at Lander, that was particularly contentious. There were several other versions of that thought process. They ultimately ended up with what's in the executive order. That process is no different than it's ever been, starting in '07. Ultimately, there are minor changes made. I will tell you that the number of changes, edits, or other things this time around was the least there have ever been. It was fairly, I think, transparent as we went through, as we narrowed it down. The biggest changes that I think we could identify, and I'll ask Amanda to comment on that, were in structure and the way that the EO was put together as opposed to what was in it. But do you want to give a quick summary of kind of what you found when you looked at all of that?
Yeah, I think you're right on, Bob. The structure was the big thing, and then there were several components that were external to the EO that got rolled into the EO. So for instance, the compensatory mitigation framework is now a part of the executive order in an appendix, as is the adaptive management framework. So I think those would be the big things. There were a couple minor things here and there, clarifications mostly.
Any other questions, thoughts on the EO process itself? So I'll ask the first one. How soon will it be before we find an error and have to fix it? It was 1 day. A typo, which got corrected. And that many words, that many eyes, that many editors, and that many authors, you're gonna have a few of those things. But I think Beth did a really good job with help from Amanda, Angie, and others to get that thing to where there are very few of those, and if they are, they can be corrected. So there were no fatal flaws that anybody picked up. Joe Scott found one, and we got it fixed before we ended up doing it, and that was an error, just a misstatement. But all in all, the governor is very happy with the way it ended up. I think you noticed that it wasn't a big bunch of fanfare going with it. It was continuing what we've done in this state, and it didn't need a bunch of fanfare. So questions or comments or thoughts on the EO itself?
Yeah, I just said, though a lot of what was in there now, was implied before, I find this one more affirmative and probably more useful because of it. Because it's not an interpretation that takes you where you need to be, it's the EO itself. So I understand some of the changes that came between the draft and the final, but this is an improvement in my way of thinking.
Agreed. Anything else? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about handbooks and manuals. Amanda, you want to lead this conversation? You're going to do it, right? Couple things. Yeah, you might as well come sit up here.
Okay.
That was enthusiastic.
How long have you been in this new job? Welcome.
Yes, thank you.
If you'll recall, what we talked about as we went through the new EO was the need to have some user's manuals, some things that people could get in and get down to the detail level, and we weren't going to put that in the executive order. The executive order, as it's now done, you have the very few whereases. Here's why. The old one, we have about a third to a quarter of what was in the final 2015 EO. Then those tie to the therefores, which are the action items, and those all tie to an appendix, which is more of the how-to or the detail. But even that, if you look at the DDCT as an example, doesn't have the detail that somebody needs if you're working on a power line or if you're looking at an oil and gas operation. You need to have more of that detail. And what everybody agreed to was creating a user's manual or some tutorial that you could then drop down and look at, and then your questions, whether they were to Amanda's shop or to Nicholas or whomever, would be tied to what it was, the product you were trying to get. And the governor is very, very emphatic that he wants to continue with that line of thought. So I think between you, Joe, and a few of us, what we need to know is where we think we need those users manuals most, because it's going to take time to get them all perfected. So do you want to comment a little on that?
The only other thing I think we talked about was that there's several areas in the EO where we reference existing MOUs or agreements, and we didn't want to try to pack all that stuff into the EO itself. So a place for those to live or be linked to anyway, so that there's a transparency of information and it's easily accessible.
Yeah.
But I agree. I think my curiosity is getting a list of the topics that we need to develop them for.
And this is open to anybody. If there are things that you particularly, Esther, in oil and gas have had frustration with, or areas that this is the appropriate place to do that. I think one example would be, we're going to tie Chris back to the half and how to do it correctly, when to do it, where to do it, what you're looking for, those kind of things. That's a manual that needs to be there. The second one that I can think of is the whole DDCT process and how it's done. with a little bit more detail than what we have in the current appendix. What are other areas that people have concerns with, and if you're behind me, just holler, just talk.
Litigation.
Huh?
Litigation.
Yeah, well, that was last week in Casper, so. And we can talk about that if we need to, but yes, that will be. Other areas?
Well, I would say that data reporting and collecting,
We're gonna get into that separately.
okay.
Yep.
Well, I don't know whether this is the right place or not, but I didn't know, maybe an outline for county planners.
Yeah, I was just looking at you, John, and thinking that somewhere we probably should have a little bit like we did on the adaptive management piece when we got done with it, a little bit of a roadmap for where is the county involved, and I'm thinking of Carbon County as it relates, say, to wind, because you have a process with wind that not all counties have, but the counties have to be involved in a lot of these. They have permits that you have to get from the county. That's oftentimes forgotten. You know, maybe even a tutorial, a list of what permits are out there that people are required to have that would trigger the use of a DDCT. The counter to that would be where you don't have to have a DDCT. And if you'll recall the meeting in Lander, the mining industry in particular said, well, do we need to do this? The answer is to protect yourself, do it, but you don't have to follow. If on a prior existing right, you don't have to follow it, you just do it. And I've run into that as a problem in particular with ag, Chris. If you're gonna put in a new water well, if you're gonna put in a stock tank or whatever it is, do the DDCT just to document that that's out there. And I think that's helpful to Nicholas too, is it not?
Yeah, the idea, especially moving forward with tracking and that sort of information that we're going to discuss later, the more that we can gather in a single cohesive place, the easier it is to track projects, even if that project isn't necessarily subject to stipulations of the executive order. At least having the DCT and saying this was consistent with the EO is a good thing.
Bob, could the county process be rolled up under just a more detailed handbook associated with Appendix A, which is that whole coordination? Because I feel like that's where a lot of the reference to MOUs and agreements happens. So we talk about roles.
And
A or D, probably.
think
Or E, sorry.
kind of an outline where to go, so that when the county goes in and amends their land use plan, then they can roll some of this in, and then when these people are coming in to get permits, or you change county planners, or it's in there, and we can roll all that information into that, to where they know if they're gonna be inside of a core area that they've gotta go through this, and it's in the county use plan. And being as we're a subdivision of the state of Wyoming, I think it's important that the counties know that how they need to follow the EO also.
Yeah, I think there's a governance piece that hasn't always been clear. In my experience, the ones that end up on my desk are ones where somebody has gone to the wrong entity first and gone through a process, and they're frustrated because they think they've done everything, and then they find out at the end they should have gone somewhere else. And I think that the more we can develop a standard procedure, certainly this was true in oil and gas, Dave and Nick and Esther, you know, you go to the BLM and you think you've done everything, and then you find out you should have been at Game and Fish, or you go through the whole Game and Fish process and then BLM has some. And I think we can do a better job of creating a roadmap for people to make this easier for everybody to understand.
I hesitate to say wiring diagram for some strange reason.
It sort of is.
But it's kind of what we're talking about, is a way to track yourself through and make sure you're hitting all the points you're supposed to hit.
Yeah, and I think as we get into this, we're not gonna do it today, but as we get into it, I wanna be sure that we have input from industry, and by industry, I mean various different components of industry. oil and gas is not the same as locatables, it's not the same as leasables, is not the same as utilities and highways, Keith. So we need to have all of those people involved in building these, so that when you get to something that the issues we ran into with Keith Fulton and YDOT this year were new to all of us. And it was kind of, well, how do you deal with that? That's a different thing, and we addressed it in the executive order, but we haven't done the drop down for that. Does that make sense to everybody? Other thoughts, other areas where you think we need to have more guidance as vis-a-vis a user's manual or an owner's manual?
So Bob, you said data reporting would be handled separately. Could you elaborate what your thoughts are on that? a little
We're
bit?
going to talk about data reporting as a separate agenda item.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and it will tie back, but I think that is a separate item, and how we're going to handle it and what we think we need to do, we'll do that as a separate conversation.
In terms of a handbook or a manual
Oh, there'll be one.
for that as well?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
gotcha.
Brian, when you brought up mitigation, were you also talking about the exception process,
Mhm.
the whole thing?
Waivers, exceptions, and modifications.
Bob,
Mhm.
I'm wondering about adaptive management, as our local, Southwest local working group just went through a trigger situation because of a fire, and that was all new, how to engage with the state. That might be a good one too. And the flow chart is really helpful, but I don't know if we need more information about that process.
Darren, what do you think?
I think, well, we're gonna talk about that a little bit today, and that'll help move that discussion along, but, we've talked about, this is one of these things that we're gonna have to figure it out through implementing it. And I think we're getting there, and for the most part, I think the groups are pretty excited about taking this on, so it's looking promising. I think we just need some good examples under our belt and develop it from there.
Thank you.
Okay. Others? Yes.
Just to clarify, so when you talk about roadmap, I guess my thinking goes to permitting and the permitting required along the way. Is that sort of part of your thinking as well, explicitly to talk about the permitting process or the steps, or is that more of a, I mean, I know it's folded into a few things like the DDCT, but permitting specifically comes to mind. Is it need to understand a little bit more?
Yeah, and I think that's what I was alluding to, is that we have at times, I think, been wrongly oil and gas centric. Everything is about oil and gas. Oil and gas is not the only activity out there. It isn't automatically a bad activity. And so that evaluation process then ties back to, it doesn't relate necessarily to a bentonite mining operation. It's a completely different scenario. And if we build everything based on what our predominant use is, it's unfair to the predominant use and it's unfair to the other uses. And I think that's where we need to have a fairly comprehensive group that looks at it and says, what does everybody do? What is an exception that oil and gas would do that's different than locatable minerals? What is an exception that highways would deal with that's different? And it's all buried in the EO, but it really comes down to judgments that have to be made by Amanda when something comes across the door, through the door, that may be different. We dealt with one a week and a half ago that never contemplated, and we're still trying to figure out what we're gonna end up doing with that one, because it's a complete outlier to everything that we've worked with. And I think we need to have something other than just gut reaction each time that guides that.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay? Other thoughts?
Yeah, so, definitely, as far as a handbook, manual, or mitigation, what happened last week in the legislative meeting relative to mitigation?
Well, Larry can help me with this. It was a very short, brief meeting that lasted for, what, 3 hours, I think?
Didn't go over at all.
It didn't go over much more than 2 hours. Joe Scott was there, Amanda was there. I'll let Senator Hicks give his impression first. I mean, you were there and participated. I think there's a path forward, but you...
So there's multiple issues out there that are trying to grapple with. policy-related issues. Part of it is the whole concept of the state requiring compensatory mitigation. That's one issue. I talked to the chairman again this morning. There's a draft bill out there. Most of the draft was originally the meeting was kind of set up to discuss the whole idea of how are we going to track credits, who are the credit providers, who's the banker, what's the liability for the state of Wyoming, how do we ensure their durability. So all those issues were discussed. You have one of the potential credit providers that was there that was concerned with some of the, I would say just.
You actually had 3 of them there.
Yeah, well, only one approved.
And then 2 potentials.
Yeah, there's some other ones out there, but the whole idea, so part of the initial gist of the meeting was is, what's the liability of the state? Because it's state policy through our compensatory mitigation that's driving this credit and debit scenario. That's under the executive order. So what's the liability for the state of Wyoming? And then if there is liability from the state of Wyoming, how do we go about ensuring that these things are trackable, verifiable, and doing that? And is that a role for the state of Wyoming to be the third-party auditor to make sure that all of that happens if there's a determination that there's a liability? And a lot of other discussions. Does that reside with the Office of State Lands and Investment? Does it reside with DEQ? Does that role reside with Game and Fish? Does it reside with the Wildlife Natural Resource Trust Fund? So I would tell you, my takeaway from the meeting is there is no clear direction from the legislature exactly where they're headed with this. I think there'll be some continued dialogue. There's a draft bill out there, but quite frankly, the draft bill is in flux. After my conversation with the chairman this morning, and I'm going to be really honest, most of the committee doesn't understand it. Vast majority. In fact, I would say when you get, it's very complicated. This has gone on for over a decade. The committee doesn't grasp all the issues out there, what's policy, what's rule, what's regulation, how the state interfaces with the federal government. All of these issues are out there, and quite frankly, it's quite daunting to try to cover in 3 hours of testimony. And for somebody, the vast majority are not directly impacted by this whole issue of sage-grouse. So I guess the takeaway is stay tuned.
Yeah, and I'll add a little bit to that. I think that's correct. We're waiting to see. They did appoint a drafting subcommittee of the Minerals Committee, which is Chairman Greer, Representative Burkhart, and Senator Rothfuss.
And 2 other members, which would be in de facto, not on the committee, was myself and Albert.
So you guys, did they add you too? Okay, good. And then they will obviously utilize input from DEQ, Wildlife Trust, SGIT, and others in doing that. The original reason for the meeting was a concern, as Larry has said, over authority and jurisdiction. And by executive order, shouldn't this be in statute, was the question that was raised during the session. I think there's a universal agreement, I hope that I'm right, that yes, it probably should be a statutory charge. And that becomes part 1. Then part 2 is, if you're going to do that and you're going to have banks and other types of mitigation, who actually certifies that that mitigation is what the state wants? And that one is open-ended. As you'll recall, in 2017, Governor Meade, by executive order, put that authority with my board, the trust board, which didn't really want it
Right.
and still doesn't.
We didn't know where to put it though.
But, correct. And so now the question, and Larry identified some of the other potentials, would be SLIB board, the State Land Investment Board, DEQ, who has dealt with this in the past, Game and Fish, although I think the conflict is inherent there. They also don't want it very bad. Where does it belong? And then give them rulemaking authority to as one of the people who testified, make, this is in quotes, a lateral transfer of the framework over should we decide to do that. So I don't get the impression that there's an intent to completely reinvent this. I think the one thing that Larry said that I agree with, after talking for 30 or 45 minutes, there were maybe 3 of them that even had an idea what we were talking about. It was very difficult, and I saw a post from one of the representatives that summarized it, and basically all it said is debits are this, credits are that, this is very complicated. And so, yeah, I think stay tuned is right, but I think there will be action proposed for the upcoming session, and it will deal with that authority jurisdiction piece, and then where will mitigation be housed. Amanda, you were there, Brian was there, Joe was there. Did you see other things that, to answer Joy's question, is that?
I think, well, there were a couple diversions during the conversation. The main concern was surrounding the legal and financial parts of credit banking versus the calculations themselves.
I think there's a mythology that's underlying it all that we need to work on. And that is that this is a great big cow waiting to be milked. And that there's all kinds of people in line to get at that udder. And the fact is that the one certified banker we have is considering not selling any more credits on grouse because it's too much trouble and there's not enough sales. So I think that underlies all the anxiety about what are we going to do with all this responsibility. Not saying it doesn't need to be dealt with, but we designed this in the first place to avoid the need to do a lot of mitigation. That was the point in minimizing disturbance. So only as we increase disturbance beyond the thresholds that we can bear do we have to look at this. And so I've been watching this, as you know, pretty closely and talking to the people involved, and they're still out there thinking this is going to be there's going to be a run on this, and we're going to have all this opportunity, and there's money to be made. Boys and girls, I just don't see it.
I think this is an important point, is that there was testimony that, and I do think our current credit provider, to their huge credit, is doing it right. They're doing all the steps one should do to create a conservation bank, but it is no cash cow. And it may be that there's underestimation of what it takes to create a bank and how much market there is. They openly said that their evaluation of credits I think he was specific to the powder, was 30 credits a year. That's 3 timing exceptions. That's what they're looking at, is what they thought they were going to be able to sell. Well, that's not a lot. And it does also show the point that people are avoiding, because they're just not needing credits. It wasn't, screw it, we're just going to go in there anyway. I mean, the system is working, sort of. In that regard,
very well.
I think it's daunting too to think about having to do credits. If there's a way you can avoid having to understand this, for God's sake, do something else, because it's going to be such a pain in the butt to even understand it that you don't want to get into it. And I think that has played hard to our benefit.
Well, I think, and I said this in the hearing, you've got to give a ton of credit to industry in this state for actually avoiding and minimizing, and they continue to do it. There are cases where they can't, and that they need to have this. The mitigation program is not about the credit providers. It's about the need that industry has to be able to do their business, and you've got to provide that third opportunity somewhere, or my take is everything's a yes or no answer, and that isn't going to work. And I think that was made pretty clear to the committee, but I go back to what Larry said. I think that most of their eyes glazed over about 3 minutes in, and I don't know that they're going to come out of it. They're in a trance now.
I also got that sense sitting in the back of the room, is that And it's a very complex and has some history and.
And I'm happy, by the way, I will share the PowerPoint that I gave them with you. It was just basically the history of the issue. Here's why we are where we are, and here's what we've done. There wasn't any, but that, if you want it, I'll be happy to get that to you.
We can just put it on the website, that'd be useful.
I don't know if I want to do that.
You don't like that idea?
If we
It's
can
already
find a way
on the
someday to
website,
make
I guess.
reclamation, restoration, enhancement attractive, that would be nice.
And there was a long conversation about that, primarily coming from Senator Rothfuss,
Yep.
that opened a big rabbit hole of, 2-year credits and stuff, but I think that one kind of reel itself back in.
I want to buy an hour and a half credit.
Yeah, well, it got there, so.
Well, just
Yeah,
to
go ahead.
elaborate just a little bit more, and talk about the statutory component.
Yeah.
So, and weigh in here if I need corrected on this, but part of the history of this group is when we pre-listing, Governor Freudenthal had established that, but in discussions with the governor's office and the Fish and Wildlife Service, they felt like a statutory committee, which this is a legislative body established committee here, the SGIT. It wasn't before, but the rationale before that is it provides more regulatory assurances to the feds that if it's a law, instead of just an executive order, because it goes on to the laws of the state of Wyoming. Similar part of the discussion gets back is that I think there was some consensus, and I won't say it was a super majority, but that a majority that if we're going to go down this road, that legislation strengthens this policy if we can craft it in the right way. Quite frankly, I think it's going to be difficult. I will be brutally honest with you. The thing that has always bothered me as the legislative representative on this committee, and my counterpart on the House is here, is the process. And this is what I tried to define for the legislature. Through the executive order, it's clearly the governor has the authority to direct agencies through rulemaking. That is a strict privilege of the executive branch of government. But when we get into the developing laws, that's the strict function of the legislative body. And where I think we blurred the lines just a little bit is the requirement to require compensatory mitigation. And this is my opinion, but it has the full force and effect of law. So that if somebody goes out there and they disturb in a core area, it is the full force of law that they will, under the executive order. And quite frankly, I think that puts the executive order on shaky ground. If we can come to that same conclusion through the legislative process and that becomes law, it strengthens that requirement. But I will be very honest with you, there is a risk of going into the legislature asking them to make a policy decision as to whether we want to enforce, as a state law, compensatory mitigation, in particular on federal lands, because the feds cannot require compensatory mitigation right now. Now, that policy is changed twice now in the last 3 years. So the Obama administration enacted that in 2016. The Trump administration repealed it in 2018. We'll probably see it come back in some time in the future. So the real test, I think, for the legislature is going to be to come up with something that withstands shifting federal policy, that accomplishes what we want to do is to protect the grounds, but also ensure that we protect those constitutionally private property rights. I don't know if we can thread that needle, quite frankly. We're going to make attempt at it. But that was my presentation to the committee, as my concerns that the executive order, when it comes to compensatory mitigation, should have really been a function of the legislative body. If we get there, it strengthens that, but you run the risk of losing that in the legislature. So,
Yeah,
quite
I think that's well said, and I wouldn't add anything. The changing administration piece is very important. Stability, that's always been important to what this group has done. We've been through 3 presidents and 3 governors since we started. And and the stability is important, but any underpinning you can give that has more authority, such as statutory authority, is good. As Larry said, the problem is when you throw a bean in the pot of the legislature, it may come out as a coconut. It may not be a bean, and so probably my guess is that this will be somewhat an iterative process with the legislature, that they will do one thing first and then look at rulemaking as it results from that. The legislature will have a chance to evaluate that, come back, and we'll probably be working on this for a year or two just to get it to where people want it and where it's right. But at this point, I think the first thing that was said is still the right thing. Stay tuned, there's more to come. And as of now, we'll continue to operate the way we have. The only thing that has changed for right now is that the state is not going to certify any new credit provider.
Okay.
So
In the meantime?
you end up with a monopoly. That's just a reality of where we are. But companies still have the ability to come in and offer mitigation that they would propose. So that's the only, I think, major change that occurred as a result of the legislature taking this on as a new topic. Is that fair? Any other thoughts? Go ahead.
I just have a couple of things. Could you reiterate who is in that subcommittee that's actually gonna be drafting that?
Chairman Greer, Senator Rothfuss, Representative Burkhart, Senator Hicks, and Representative Summers.
Okay, and then, if I recall correctly, in the EO, given that the Bureau of Land Management plans indicated that they're no longer going to mandate compensatory mitigation, but they're gonna follow the states, when we have that we're in Wyoming going to do compensatory mitigation, there was a memorandum of understanding developed between the federal agencies. And so does that have any kind of legal binding, like, authority? I mean, it's just an MOU.
It's an
so
agreement of how to conduct business. I don't know that you could call it. It's a contract, so it has legal underpinning, but it's also, it can be voided, I think, in 30 days. Jenny,
Okay.
in 30 days by any of the parties so it's.
Well, and Bob, just one clarification. It says that the BLMIM says that the BLM may. It doesn't say they will comply with the executive order. It says they may comply with the executive order. So
What's
it's
the-
kind of permissive.
I don't know if
The
it's-
MOU may be more
It
specific
is.
than that.
The IM is made, the MOU is will.
And I don't know if complies, or it's really
No.
they look at what the state does and consider that beneath the document.
And I think that's the word, isn't it, Jenny, is that they will consider,
Yes, but if it's made law,
then it would be different.
And that's what Senator Hicks are saying.
Yeah, the interpretation by the secretary now is that the executive order carries the same authority as law, so they will follow it. But as Senator Hicks has said, it doesn't necessarily do that. That's why we're having this conversation.
Well, and Bob, just to put a really fine point on it, because this is gonna be the big issue, is if the BLM does that, it's at the request of the state.
Right.
Strictly at the request of the state. So effectively, it's the state putting these stipulations on those, not the federal government. So that's the real debate issue that I think is gonna be a little bit problematic when we get into the legislature, is that, because there's a lot of people think that now the state's more of a regulatory body than the federal government. And that just, that typically that flies in the face of the ideology within the state of Wyoming, that we're the regulators, not the feds. So, but that's the real, just to put a point on it, that is gonna be the real issue out there as this thing moves forward, so.
I just to remind everybody, we have 2 or 3 states whose total plan is dependent on this relationship of mitigation for grouse. And so, as we're channeling under this, be careful of the foundations. We're exposed to their limits.
And if you think that we're struggling, and I don't think struggling is the right word. I think we're trying to get a finer point on it. But my God, talked to at least 3 other states. I have talked to all 3 of them in the last month. They are struggling.
And when you say 3 other states, Montana?
I'm not gonna name them.
Oh.
But you know where they are. Richard, you had a question?
Yeah, I might have misunderstood. It's very easy for me to do so. But I thought that I heard the credit providers say that they were selling credits into Idaho.
No.
Sure.
Yeah.
Idaho hasn't even confirmed its program.
No, they're just now starting to look at what other states are doing and figure out what they're going to do.
So the question though would be, would Wyoming consider allowing an out-of-state credit provider?
At this point, I don't think we would. It's a state-driven program, and we. This is my personal opinion. I'm not speaking for anybody else. If you open that door, then you're going to mitigate in Nevada for birds in Wyoming. They're not even the same region. It cuts against both ways. I mean, Utah isn't going to mitigate in Wyoming either. I don't think that.
We're still stumbling around the edges of, is it contiguous or distant?
Yeah.
I mean,
But under that scenario, Bob, where the one that we do have is a federally certified sage-grouse bank, if the feds decided to allow them to cross state
Yeah.
lines, unless we had something in the executive order
Right.
or legislation that had a prohibition upon that, and I still don't think our law would oversee. If you have, let's say, a utility company that's going to string a large power line all the way across the western United States.
Like the one sitting next to you?
And it was determined that some other state was going to have a compensatory mitigation, have the same framework, and the BLM over there said, well, we'll recognize it.
Yeah.
And it could very well be the BLM in one of our adjoining states say, go buy it from the federally recognized, and there's nothing we could do to stop that.
Well, except that their service area, I believe, is the state of Wyoming. Tyler, is that correct?
Say it again.
The service area for the existing bank is the state of Wyoming.
It is drawn on the state boundaries.
Now, that could change. Again, that's one of the reasons, back to Joy's original question, one of the reasons to try and get this done is that we know administrations are going to change. Believe me, I can tell you they change a lot. And so, having some stability is really an attractive part of it. So.
The other thing that just worth noting is that we lost the net conservation gain.
Correct.
Piece of it too. So along with the BLM mitigation, just another example of
Okay.
that level.
Is that the answer you wanted when you asked that question?
I was looking for those details, thank you.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to adaptive management. We can take a break if you want, but
Bob,
let's. Yeah.
with regard to the handbooks and manuals, I'm wondering what's the best structure for moving those forward? And I'm almost wondering if it might be appropriate, feel free to disagree with me, if the groups that came together for the individual appendices might consider whether or not a handbook or manual is appropriate for that appendix.
I think that's very appropriate.
Work on and putting together an outline.
Yeah, and
then
I
you have
think
that mix.
let's just say by the end of the month, if those chairs could get with their people and see if they think there is one needed and what it would be. In your, I don't know, Esther, in yours, I doubt it. But then we would have that roadmap, and as we get through this meeting, maybe we'll send a reminder out of the topics that were thrown out here on the table. But there are probably 3 or 4.
I think for the most part, these topics fit into one of the other.
They do. I think that's a good suggestion, Amanda.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, let's take a 5 minute stretch and then we'll do adaptive management. As we mentioned, one of the areas that was new to this executive order, or certainly much more lined out, was the adaptive management portion. That took several iterations, but I think that where we landed with that appendix, it's kind of in the right spot. But I'm going to ask Darren and Amanda to talk a little bit about implementation of the adaptive management appendix. In particular, as we move forward, Julie, as you mentioned, you ran into one down there in the Southwest. So do you want to just give us a quick rundown on that?
Yeah, so from a federal perspective, we've been initiating adaptive management since 2015. So in that process, we look at it a bit differently than what's incorporated into the Appendix I here. We look at it at ESU, biologically significant unit level, that being the core areas as a whole. So we look at each individual core area and that overall health as far as the habitat portion of it goes. We work with Leslie and her shop to identify any kind of population trends within those core areas that might be an aberration of something that we would consider out of flux. So through the process of trying to figure out what deviation constitutes an adaptive management trigger, we started to develop this process that was in all federal plans, and thankfully the state of Wyoming has really stepped up with its local working groups and tried to piece together how we address this from a more ground level approach and then feed that up the chain. So kind of one of the necessary pieces of this was folks at the state level. How are we going to identify that information as it's fed up from the ground to identify how that might be impacting other populations within the state, not populations, but areas in the state. So there needs to be some kind of, not hierarchy, but information center at the state level that kind of has a pulse on what's going on in the state and how these triggers may be impacting other areas. So I think that's kind of the emphasis of what we wanted to talk about today is who's in that group, really? Because, I mean, the feds have been enacting this since 15. We haven't had a ton of triggers, thankfully. We've had one up in the Buffalo County activity, one in your part of the world over there, Bear River, and then Jackson Hole population standpoint. So just trying to, like I was saying before, try to work through this and try to figure out what the best process is. Now, the local working group piece is pretty obvious. The technical team, they're experts that they have to call upon to be involved to get that information out and to identify when a trigger's tripped and then feeding that up the chain so that folks, which I can imagine Leslie and myself and whoever needs to be part of that group can identify and get together and say, okay, if we have a situation going on here, let's get a report from them and then see what else is going on around the state, really. So yeah, I mean, that's when that first trigger tripped, we were trying to really figure out who was on those groups, where that information was coming from, and then that kind of developed into that flow chart in time. So, yeah, I guess the request is, you know, if we have other entities that want to be involved to try to identify and confirm when these triggers have been tripped, and then evaluate the local working group's plans on how to respond to those triggers. I'm all for hands if people got them, because right now, you know, Leslie works it out on a population standpoint. I look at it annually on a habitat standpoint, which oftentimes might not be soon enough. Well, a good example right now is the Pedro fire. We're kind of watching the Pedro fire to see how that's going to impact the Natrona core area. You know, we have different proposals going on, and Natrona, and that's approaching the 5% cap every day. So we're trying to identify through this state working group, you know, do these disturbances constitute a trigger where we would have to respond in some kind of way? Do we have any kind of management response or curtailment of activities that need to occur? If we could identify what those causal factors were, and if that was clear. So I just wanted to basically make you guys aware of it's essentially game and fish and BLM. We probably need a Forest Service outlet or voice. I don't know if, if industry needs to be involved as far as, types of activities in the event that we have a trigger that, we would have some kind of management decision to have to hash out. So, yeah.
So a couple things, Darren. The first is the way that the adaptive management was designed was that there is a state group that is named in the MOU. And that's the 4 federal agencies and then 4 from the state. I believe those 4, help me Amanda, are the Governor's Office, Game and Fish, State Lands, and SGIT. I think it's 4 and 4. The state can add more as appropriate. So for instance, in a case of a fire, you may want to add forestry, who handles all the fire response. But that group would be engaged when you hit a hard trigger. Soft triggers should be being dealt with locally, and then if they feel that they need to move that up, they could ask for that statewide group to meet. Is that your understanding, Leslie?
I'm learning as I go,
Okay.
so that makes sense.
And that's what we tried to build into that appendix, was that you're gonna hit soft triggers all the time. And there's a point where that becomes elevated to where we need to look at it at a larger level. But soft triggers don't automatically or rarely would they imply that you would make some management action without that causal effect analysis.
I'm not sure that the MOU differentiates between the hard and soft trigger tripping for consultation with the statewide adaptive management group. It looks like the statewide adaptive management working group, along with the local working groups, should be communicating on all triggers tripped and evaluating information.
But it's meant to come from the ground up. It is not meant to have a statewide group that goes down. So
What it says in the executive order is that local working groups will identify when and where a trigger may be tripped and communicate a need for review to the statewide
correct.
adaptive management working group. So there are 3 kind of triggers. At the moment, we think they're all soft triggers, but the executive order doesn't differentiate between hard and soft either. So we kind of have 3 triggers that are kind of waiting for that step, a need for review to the statewide group.
If that is what the local working group feels is necessary. So I think the discretion goes back to that local working group. If it's an issue that they can deal with, and there are discrete things out there that they would say, well, we know what the cause is, we can deal with it. There's no need for that to be reviewed at the state level. We're relying on those local working groups to make that call. Yeah.
My only concern with it just being a either or in that situation is I can foresee potential for the local working group not to reach consensus, and that should automatically kick it up to the next level.
I would agree generally. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, with the whole concept of the soft and the hard triggers, and getting back to the discussion, Leslie's looking at population and we're looking at habitat. Is that solely at the discretion of the local work group as to is it habitat or is it population?
It's both. They have to, hard trigger has to be both. A soft trigger, it may be an anomaly, and I would think that what Leslie would be looking at is, okay, pick a core area, and we had a decline that was greater than all the other core areas. That would probably constitute a soft trigger and a review.
So let me ask you a question under that scenario. Where does the DDCT come in? Because isn't that a hard trigger? Once you exceed that 5% of disturbance, or so is that tool used at all in determining soft and hard? I'm just trying to walk through the actual process of how this would work.
It still comes down to the causal factor.
Yeah.
And not just the 5%. It's going to be what's determined by the local working group. That's our job, is to try to identify the causal, I believe.
Yeah, and the parameters that we use to identify are loss of habitat and loss of population.
So it could be.
And loss of habitat, loss of population, or loss of active legs. It's those three. And so it's not easy to hit a hard trigger. It's very easy to hit a soft trigger. And it's left intentionally somewhat open-ended on the bottom end for someone to come in and say, I think we have a problem here. And then that would be where the local working group would engage. And then they could elevate that as they saw fit. Tom is right. You don't want gridlock at the local working group to halt everything. That would probably be an indicator where they'd go, hey, we need some help. And then what the statewide group would do is empower a technical team that would include industry, would include biologists, would include land managers to look at that and come back and say, okay, here's what we think the causal factor is, and here's what the remedies may be. Does that help?
Is that how the EO reads? So the next
The
sentence
appendix.
is, in consultation with the local working group, the statewide group would then assemble a technical team comprised of local specialists to develop a response strategy. So the local working group is not developing a response strategy on their own, but the statewide is assembling a technical team to develop a response strategy.
Yeah, and the concept of that was that you have a local working group that says, we think we have a problem. Your local working groups are made up of a cross-section of society. Your technical team would be people in that area. It may be a BLM range con. It may be the Game and Fish Wildlife Habitat individual. It may be a biologist from any entity. It may be a private corporation. It may be a biologist who works for Occidental. That group would say, well, who are the best people to do this analysis in that area, and trying to keep it more localized. That was the concept behind that. And that kept the local working group from feeling they had to be the technical team and excluding people who were more of a broad policy group for that area. And that's what the concept was behind it.
So I would say 2 local working groups are saying we have a problem and would like to engage in statewide adaptive management work.
Okay.
So
An email.
To you?
Yep, that'll work.
So my next question, the local working groups have been working under the MOU and have been kind of working with the BLM for the past, well, one has been working for the past year and a half, kind of on moving through this process. So my question is, should they continue with their activities, or should they pause until they engage the statewide group?
My gut tells me it's time to pause and engage the group. If they feel that they're at that point, then they should probably say, hey, we need to activate that state group and look at a technical team and those kind of things. But I may be wrong. Others may see it differently. How do other people feel?
I mean, it seems logical if the working group is wanting assistance.
I guess my thought is probably with the one, it is time, there's a lot of angst out there.
Yeah.
And it's the fear of the unknown and all the different things that are being thrown on the table. I think it's time we get to kick it up and get that. I'm getting that feedback from the commissioners in the one region. And so I really, yes, we need to kick it up.
And I think, and we'll talk about that later, Leslie and I need to visit about that, but you also get 2 things going on at the same time, or 3, and they need to be sorted out. So the question of the trigger and the question of adaptive management is independent of other things that are being proposed. That part needs to get sorted out. So I agree with John. I think it would be appropriate at this point to say, hey, can we get that group together? And then the appendix and the MOU make it quite clear the process that would be followed. So an email to me is fine. I'll get a hold of the other people and say, hey, we need to have a meeting and we'll get that going.
Bob, under that scenario question, because isn't the statewide adaptive working group and the technical team specific to those habitat population issues? These other issues that you may be
Yes,
referring
correct.
should come to this group?
Correct, exactly.
Not go to the state technical
Correct.
committee, they come to the CIGIT.
Yep.
And that would be a proposal from that local work group?
Correct.
Okay, just want to clarify.
And then that would be up to the CIGIT to review, comment, we've done it before, we just haven't done it recently, so I think people don't have it in their mind how that process worked. And if you recall, when we did it in 2014, the process worked, the groups came with their recommendations, this group went back with theirs. You know, there were 2 or 3 iterations of that process, and that's how that should work, so, yeah. Does that give you what you guys needed? Okay. Next item is the data collection and reporting. And the governor, just as we discussed this as we were completing the EO, had several things that were concerns of his, in the sense that he wanted to be sure that we didn't burden the state with some requirement or imply some requirement we could not afford. So we've asked Angie and Amanda and Nicholas and others to look at what kind of things and what costs are out there. We're at the beginning of that process. Joe Scott has kind of taken this on from the get-go, and I'm going to ask Joe to go through a little bit of what his thoughts are and then get feedback from the group as to how to proceed. Is that a fair introduction, Joe?
Yeah, and so I think I want to be clear on the goal for today as it relates to this in my mind is I have just a quick document to throw up on the screen that kind of shows who are the permitters in the state and what do they do. It's nothing more than that, but the thing the group needs clarity on is what do people in SGIT want to see? What are the data points people want to see collected? Because then we use that to inform, to go back and say, all right, can we provide that? And if we can, what would it take to provide that? So if you don't give me your hopes and dreams, I can't crush them.
Yeah, and let's, as we go through this, I think that we need to be mindful of needs and wants. There are some things that I think we can all agree we really need. There are a lot of things I think we can all agree we'd really like to have, but cost and manpower is going to determine that, and we need to have, at a minimum, what is absolutely necessary. As an example, LEC counts are absolutely necessary. That's not an added burden. The department does that anyway, but that is a necessary data point that we need to have. As we get down into this, there are things that, yeah, it'd be great if we had it, but maybe we can't. And that's, we're working through that with Nicholas now as far as how we pay for some of the things that we have and that we do. But the governor needs to know there's a dollar sign attached to this, and he's not moving until we know kind of what that is.
And attached to that piece is that in all these areas, this is specifically attached to permitting. So in this context, I didn't include things that would go into, I didn't include in this list here. And that cost idea is going to be tied in. So we take the ideas of what people want to see, take them back to the group, and then the agencies can figure out what they can and can't do currently, and then what it would cost to get there, and then we can come back to those costs sometime in early 2020. So I've just split this out by permitting agencies. So State Engineer's Office, they do groundwater permits and surface water permits, and they would also be involved if there was compensatory mitigation required. They could tell you whether somebody actually used it. groundwater permits are mostly wells, groundwater wells, of all types. And surface water, I think the main thing we would think about there is reservoirs. They permit all reservoirs. Some things are dual permitted. CBM wells were dual permitted by the state engineer's office in our office. A lot of ponds, what they would call surface water impoundments, we would call pits, and we would end up dual permit. That has some to do with other things, but that's the kind of stuff that they cover. So the question is, what does the group want to see points? Do they want to see shape files? Do they want to see permitted versus constructed?
Question, when you talk about the information they provide, are we talking about only in core or everything that the agency permitted? Because that could be monuments more data than just if we're dealing with core or sage-grouse.
I think that's a great question. So do you want to see numbers like I permitted this many in core and I permitted this many in seasonal 2-mile buffer and my overall number of permits were X. So as a percentage, is that number interesting to anybody? Is that something people want? Or you just want cut, I did this much in core, and do you want to split it out, core, connectivity? These are the kind of things I want to know.
So one thought on that is that, back to your original question, the real key part of any of that is going to be the amount of potential disturbance. It's the shapefile. The number of permits, it's a number, you can report it, but as we found out in the last month with the media, numbers can get pretty complicated. We start throwing things out, and you saw a lot of wild figures thrown around the last month that were incorrect or were misleading. So, Amanda, you're the one that's going to have to deal with it. You want to know what actually has been permitted out there that has an impact on habitat, correct?
Yeah, I'm not sure what just the overall broad number would really tell us, other than how proficient the state engineer's office is at moving permits through.
Agreed.
I would run us back to where this committee started, which was in looking at the COT report, which is where we made a decision, where a decision was made about whether or not the bird needed to be listed based on a series of statistics. And we categorized those statistics, and what we actually, I think, need to be doing is seeing how these things fit servicing those statistics. It isn't a number, it's acres. It isn't it isn't as a population question, not a question of what did the permitting agency think. So to me, what we should be doing is overlaying this with that graph that we put together, or something like it, that says this is what would feed that answer. We literally went through and defined what answers we were looking for, and we can determine from looking at that whether or not the question we ask is fulfilling that answer, rather than taking a wide ranging, we're going to get everything from everybody and pile it in a heap and see what it smells like. I think it'd be a whole lot better if we get in a place where we're going, well, this has to do with habitat quality, and this is the impact we've had. And it also had an opportunity, and this is where credits mean more to me, where we talk about what we did with that habitat to make it better, what we did that made it worse, and balancing those two as we started doing those graphs. So to me, that would help a lot with in getting into a less general sort of, what are we going to do?
And I think that's the rabbit hole we don't want to go down. This has been about acres and chickens, right?
Yeah.
So if you start talking how many groundwater permits, I don't know that has anything to do with either of those two. I think what you need is, if that groundwater permit led to disturbance or led to a change in the
exactly
habitat,
right.
you report it. If not, it's just a number. And you can report the numbers, but
And at some point, we're going to have to talk about the difficulty with some of these numbers. And the difficulty, there's a completeness and an accuracy difficulty to the numbers.
correct.
Because I can tell you that, well, at least I'm reasonably certain, the state engineer's office does not have inspectors that go out and see whether they disturbed 34 acres or 35 acres or 40 acres.
But isn't that, can't we do that through WIGIS? I mean, we have the point, you can calculate that.
I can't calculate points off, acre off of a point, but if we could, I mean,
Fluid.
we could ask them to self-report acres and associate a number with a point.
There's a self-reporting, or there's ways to get there.
Well, let's stick to the topic, which is what is the data we need before we
Right.
start requiring reporting or anything else, so. Anything else then on state engineer?
So going back up to that, or Joe, is there a need to have the, I mean, I guess if you're linking the and links, the permitted and actual, because really what we want is the actual. If it's just permitted and never built, who cares?
Okay, so that's a big difference. Do you want what's permitted or only what's built, or do you want both?
Well, going back to Brian's comment, the permitted stuff, I mean, we've got stuff in Thunder Basin that's been permitted for
20
quite some
years.
time, and there's nothing ever been done with it. So to me,
Correct.
what you need to see is what is actually out there disturbing the habitat. So I would say what we want to see is just actual. The permit, again, may be an interesting tracking thing. It may say what might happen in the future, but really what we want to see is what's done.
We even had a big discussion about as-bills.
Right.
Because industry frequently will tell us, well, we did less than we were permitted for. But if we use the permit as the answer, we're trying to answer for everything that they permitted, not what they did. So I don't know if everybody's familiar with the term, but as-bills, where you actually say, this is what we did, would be a real contributor to figuring out what we've got to compensate for.
And we're getting there. I think Dave has a good point, that really what we need to report is what actually happens out there, not what might.
From a data management perspective, I would think that you would want both, and you would want the attribute information to tell if it's a permitted or an actual disturbance, because you do want to know what's going to go in. Maybe some stuff is not even permitted, it never gets put in, or maybe it was permitted in December of 2019, and it's actually going to be built in January 2020. So
I'm with you.
Yeah, you want both.
But I think one of those is a management tool and the other is a reporting metric.
There's also
Thank you.
other people are going to use that number. Other people are going to attempt to acquire that number and use it. So
I mean, I think if you had the attribute
There's-
information to tell the difference, you could report it, and like, this is what's actually.
Yeah.
sure, there's something to be said for having the number in your back pocket.
Joe, just from a number, keeping track, this group has always put an emphasis on valid and existing rights. If that has a valid permit, what's stopping them from developing it next year? So I think with that in mind, keeping track of permitted data is a very important thing to do.
For
Because-
example, the DDCT tool counts permitted.
Exactly. Once the permit is
As
no longer
disturbance.
valid, then I think we can take it off the books if it hasn't been built. But to not count disturbance that is basically in line ahead of maybe some other disturbance, I think has the potential to shoot ourselves in the foot.
I think that's fine, but the story has to be told. So, just like you did with the leasing things, it sounds bad when you start saying hundreds of thousands of acres have been leased or potentially leased, and, which doesn't have the same number of what actually is gonna be built. So, I mean, if you collect that data, if we use it or report it or however we're gonna do it, it's absolutely gonna tell the story that this is permitted. Doesn't mean anything until it's actually disturbed. And then what the acres are disturbed is
It gives you the full
for us, the habitat component of that, is the actual acres.
Do any of these, and Esther, I'm looking at you. Do any of these imply a cost that is unreasonable? Or are these just teasing out things we would normally have? And I guess I'm thinking about Dave or one of you guys. You go in and permit a 40-acre well pad, you build it at 20. if we get the as-built, that's what's reported as the disturbance. The permit was permitted, but we can shoot ourselves in the foot both ways, Nicholas. We can over-report or we can under-report.
Sure.
We need to know what's out there permitted because that's potentially disturbed. But once the activity has actually taken place or gone away, the as-built is what is actually there. And the DDCT can calculate that if you have the actual.
Correct, we can update, so that, the DECT is run off the proposal, of course, because it's pre-permit. Once we have an as-built, we can go in and then
Adjust it.
change what is in the statewide as flagged as complete for that project.
So let's try and remember that there, as I said to Nissa, one of them is a management profile, the other is a reporting. And what we really need to focus on here is what are we going to report?
That's right.
That's the important part, because at the end of the day, what we need to do is have a balance sheet that shows where we've increased or improved habitat and where we've had disturbance. Those are the two factors we need to report. You agree with that? Go ahead.
Bob, I'm assuming that once we go through here and see what's the SGIT would like to see, that'll go back to the agencies. The agencies will say, well, this is what's gonna take time and manpower wise.
Yeah.
Gets back to your question, it needs to be realistic, and I think be realistic, it's gotta be done with existing manpower. So if they come back in and say, well, you guys want all this information, it's 2 FTEs or another full-time employee, that's probably not gonna happen.
Because what I didn't want to do is have a discussion with the agencies, well, what can you provide? Well, that's kind of a silly question when we don't know what the need is. So this is about getting our heads around what data is needed. And in some cases, like oil and gas, for example, is under a fairly large overhaul of a database system. So putting a couple check boxes in now would have basically zero cost attached to it. So there are some things that we could be doing in processes that are changing currently that may not be available for a year or two, but there's not really a cost associated with them if we know about
Bob, I'm concerned about the science if we don't stick to what actually has happened. Because we're supposed to be tracking the impacts on the habitat and the bird. And if we're putting in anticipated damage that hasn't occurred, it's gonna skew what we study as to what we achieved. So that's why I understand the simplicity of this is what we permitted, but if we are going off of just what's permitted and hasn't been done, it throws a major monkey wrench into anybody figuring out what our impacts. And the beauty of this whole thing, just as a reminder, is we approached it as a scientific experiment to see how we could manage this bird without damage over time. So we gotta make sure we're at least, from a conservation viewpoint, I could be going, yeah, anticipate all that breakage. But I wanna know what we're doing. I don't want to load the outcomes.
So let me ask a question, because this conversation, and we're kind of coming circling around again. I think you could put in every one of those boxes data SGIT would like to see, put actual disturbance. That's the answer. And I'm looking at, you also have to tie it back to what are potential threats. Grazing and ag leases, why do you need that? Is there a disturbance associated with it? No. Is it a threat? No. It's that, how many are out there? Do we need that? Do we need to report it? I don't think that's, I think.
This is one of the questions I had is de minimis activities. So most groundwater wells would be a de minimis activity. Do we care enough to find a way to report it?
I think you need to reflect the disturbance that is associated with it. That's all it is. You're just reporting that was a disturbance.
And I think where I think we got off is, like with groundwater, there's your permit to drill, and then there's your actual permit you get when you complete. And I think the completed permit is all we need to see.
Correct. Julie?
Thank you. Just to clarify, because we've talked about executive order, regulated areas, now you're talking about de minimis. I'm hearing the word habitat, so that makes me wonder, are we just talking core, or are we talking non-core as well?
So EO regulated areas would be core, connectivity, winter concentration, and then in non-core, it would be the 1/4 mile, 2 mile.
Thank you, that was helpful, that was one question. So a couple other questions then. For mining, we already submit an annual report where if we had a disturbance in core, that would be recorded, and that is being required to be recorded.
And DQ thanks you for doing that.
Well, and mining doesn't do shape files. We are moving into that arena. That is not something we've got to do before.
We're getting there.
I know. So I just wanted a little.
Nor does the state engineer sometimes.
Good. Good to know. So I just want to kind of confirm that is what is already being required of us in the DEQ annual reports, the sufficient mechanism to provide this required data.
Probably.
Well, and DEQ sitting on that side is getting it from all sorts of areas, so they know what they're receiving, and so that's part of it. Here's what we can provide, and they have that information.
I want to, and Julie, in particular as it relates to mining and even more specifically to coal, there has been a great reluctance to do as-built or report what actual disturbance is. That is counterproductive to the industry itself, because you are over-reporting, vastly over-reporting. And understand how the permitting works and why that's done. But we've met with all of the different mining groups and tried to explain, and that's why I say I think we're now getting where the data that you can report in whatever form is the correct data, as opposed to just giving a giant rectangle and saying there's our mine permit boundary, and in the mine permit boundary you've disturbed 5 acres out of 5,000. That's not a correct reflection. So,
and to be clear to the group, if we have the actual number, we have the permanent number is a lot easier to get. Actual disturbance, I'll just tell you, is going to be the hardest thing to get on this list, even though it's the most important, because there are many instances where it's not collected as a function of any one permitting agency. And from working with a very large range of oil and gas companies, some oil and gas companies, they may have as-built, they may have contoured, they may have a lot of information, and somebody else told Mike on the dozer to go build him a pad over there. And he didn't know how big it was going to be until he got there, so.
get rid of Mike.
We deal with both of those kinds of people in court.
So let me ask a question, Nicholas. There is a step in between this, I think, where you have a permitted activity and it's completed. The next DDCT, you could actually get the actual footprint when you run it, correct?
If there was updated imagery and someone challenged that particular area, yes. For the most part, it would not be automatic, no.
No, I'm not saying it's automatic. I'm trying to get at the cost side of this. There is the ability to do that exists, but it takes time and somebody analyzing that
Well,
imagery.
It would take either a lot of agency cooperation or very, very frequently updated imagery.
Yeah, that's the delays, and you'd have to acquire the imagery.
Okay, but if we look at the way development occurs in the state, it isn't just randomly scattered across the landscape. There are areas that are having development. There are areas we know we're going to have development. You're going to be back on those imagery, you're going to be back on those on a regular basis. So if it were a part of the updating of that imagery each time you did it, then what I need to know is what's the cost of doing that, because that would help with the true picture. And I don't think the state engineer is going to go start giving you shape files all of a sudden of as-built, because A, they don't have them, and B, they don't have the software, and it ain't gonna happen. So maybe that's a function that we need to think about doing where you have the capability to do it.
That's certainly a possibility. We can look into the cost.
There's some, state agencies can kind of go through solutions, like when you build a pond, somebody had a drawing, and that drawing is probably producible in a shape file. So it could be just a, hey, I need you to submit this. And if they already have it, it's not a big deal. There are other areas where people don't have them that are. But we'll
Okay,
all
let's
do
keep,
that.
let's keep going.
So
Question.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how this ties into the original scorecard that we talked about. And it seems like we were talking about actual disturbances on that scorecard and conservation actions.
We were, but we're not reporting actual, we're reporting permitted.
Right. This is,
I got the scorecard up on my computer right now, and it's just, there is a simple set of categories across the top and down the side. We really tried to make it where it was doable. And I think we're really struggling to make this as hard as we can, instead of figuring out how we answer energy, mineral development and mining, ag conversion, infrastructure, urbanization, and burns and treatments. That's the whole left side of the bracket. That's what we're trying to get at, is acres damaged, and then across the top, we've got what we did about it. Acres reclaimed. And so that's the reporting that, first of all, I've been pushing with WAFLA at the state's behest. And this is a simple approach. I think if we try to throttle back and not make Joe have a complete coronary up there,
I won't have.
we would have a better opportunity here.
So are we at that simple point where the data that the CIGIT would like to see is actual disturbance?
And there are some other pieces, but I think I get the takeaway. You want to see actual disturbance. If you had your druthers, it's spatially provided.
I think that's
For any permitted action by any agency inside a regulated area.
correct.
So we'll just assume that for every.
Okay, Julie?
Another kind of generic question, what that doesn't capture though is disturbance that was avoided or minimized?
You can't. I
It's-
wish.
you can't prove a negative.
Yeah,
Completely agree.
Yeah.
okay.
But in
it also
essence,
doesn't
Julie,
count.
in essence, it does capture that because it doesn't show as disturbance.
That's right, we're not trying to deal with it, but across the top, just to be clear, it deals with reclamation, restoration, all the improvement stuff that we do by acre as well. So we're doing a balancing act here of trying to show limited damage at least.
Sure, but avoidance and minimization is immediate. Reclamation, restoration, those are years down the road before you can start to measure anything.
Those are also harder
Correct.
permitted activities.
Correct.
Because you gotta define those terms, and then you got somebody to look at.
Yeah, we got to ground truth it. Okay, you want to go through
So
your
just
other
to go
agents?
through other agencies, what they do, and Jason's here, so he can, temporary use permits, I'll just let you kind of describe what each of these items actually are.
Joe, can you make it a little bigger before we go
Can
through?
I make it
Sorry.
bigger? What do you?
Just a tiny, just.
You really have a high view of my technical savvy.
Just there, good. Okay, thank you.
So what we were asked was give us all the permitting vehicles that you have. So these are all the vehicles that we have to get permits. They're not the actual disturbances. There's not oil and gas wells, there's not pits like Joe's saying, but we have roads, we have power lines, we have all of the normal things that a landowner would have. And these are the vehicles that we put them in. So I don't know if you need much more explanation than that.
So a temporary use permit would cover.
A 1 to 5 year activity.
But generally some form of disturbance in place.
Yeah, every single one of these are gonna have disturbance. So they're on that one. And ag and grazing's on there because we do conversions. So the same vehicle has a farming component as well as a grazing component. So,
What would a service contract be?
timber sale, some type of road enhancement, building or something.
I I think the answer is still the same, actual.
That's fine.
But what I'll also say is every single one of our uses comes with a stipulation,
Mhm.
because it's required, so it's protected. So what the word I wrote down through your conversation is, everything we do through those vehicles, there's an implemented protection because that EO's attached to it. So maybe that's something you can use in your reporting, that there's an implemented protection on that use, on that activity.
Jason, do you track the acres?
Yeah, every single lease has an acre component, but again, it's the big permitting.
Versus actual disturbance.
Department of Transportation is fairly easy, anything to do with a road, so that would include temporary storage.
Anything
areas.
outside the right-of-way that was associated with that project would be reportable
And
as it is now.
And they have the data.
Yep, we've already gone down that road. I think we're pretty comfortable with where
Yeah,
we're
that
headed
one's
there.
a pretty easy one. Game and Fish gets into some of the less acre tangibles that were listed in Appendix H, which is exceptions. So this tracks, they have data on how many exceptions they recommend.
And how many pertinent acres are associated with
Right. And how many compensatory mitigation credits were recommended.
it, right?
They don't necessarily have the back end, how many exceptions actually went forward and how that would be in the respective permitting agencies, that they would generally recommend. You might not know, or generally don't know, if those got carried forward and actually went through.
True.
So generally.
But you would pick that up.
Agency side.
Agency by agency.
So
and
they would report how many they recommended, and other agencies could report how those were constructed.
Which
So there's
is-
an interfinger piece there that has to be figured out.
It still ties back though to actual disturbance, because that's where you're gonna
Right.
have to pick it up.
Right.
So, not to throw a dirty diaper on the campfire, but, so.
Have you done that?
Where did that come from? Experience.
Camping with Leslie.
Try to cook hamburgers after that, it's terrible. So Brian.
We're trying to break for lunch here.
So Brian, on the scorecard, I'm trying to understand, you have, I see your table here. Where's the bird response?
It's a separate report.
Totally separate. So we're talking just about,
This is a disturbance and restoration reclamation parameter.
There's another table for that, I just
there's
don't know.
another table for bird response. So,
Yeah. But you already showed us the bird response table
Yeah.
effectively.
okay, so somewhere those two are gonna come together and.
In the reporting, yes.
All right, dirty diaper averted.
I can't get that thought out of my
I
head
know,
now.
it's
It's kind of
terrible.
I've even made a lot of buffalo shell fires, and that's a little rough.
Okay, yes.
Question for Jason on prescribed burns that OSLI and the state forester does. Is that a permitted process? Is that just something?
Right now, we don't do it. It's all federal thing.
It's all federal.
Well, DEQ would issue a smoke permit, and that would be the permitted action for a prescribed burn.
On
with
private,
DEQ.
yeah, or on state. Okay,
That's what one I did. Okay, so. So oil and gas, obviously we do APDs and pits. Exemptions is a bit of a complicated topic that's in the list. I personally think it might need a little more definition, because I've been asked by certain groups how many exemptions, and for everybody differentiate between exceptions. Exceptions are based on biological data administered by game and fish. Exemptions have to do with prior existing rights.
Legal.
For certain certain other very rare circumstances, but generally, prior existing rights. So I've been asked, how many exemptions do you get? Well, it depends what you call an exemption. If somebody wants to do a stimulation on a well that is gonna take less than a day, it's in sage-grouse habitat, but they have a prior existing right, I write exempt on that. But that's a much different exemption than somebody who's building a 5-acre pad based on an exemption.
So can we take every single one of these back to, if it results in a disturbance, then it would be reported?
Yeah.
We're throwing too much data against the wall, and it has to be tied to disturbance, I think.
So we're gonna not worry about the activity piece.
No, because if you go into an existing well on an existing pad and frack it, or you go in and you change your wellhead or whatever you do, that, you can't count that that exemption as another disturbance. There's one disturbance there.
Right, I agree, it's not a disturbance, but it would be a regulated, so it goes back to the timing stipulations that are applied. There's an activity that's either occurring or not occurring. And so I think that's a hard piece to get at, so if we agree we just wanna start with disturbance, I would be very happy with it.
Anybody disagree with that?
I think one thing to consider though, I mean, the conversation continues to happen about minimization and what measures are taken. I mean, if you just said that it's difficult to track that, but in some ways, if that is, for example, activities occurring on an existing pad, that is minimization, right? So if you're tracking this information, you could use that to.
I think we're tracking information that hurts the point that we're trying to make. And I think that I can tell you that because I get to deal with the media, and they come up with numbers of things that they call and ask somebody. It's no different than calling the state and asking how much money is in an account. Well, you don't ask how much of that has been encumbered to pay for something. So then you get people making wild statements about, this is how many exemptions we're given. Well, okay, but how many of those had any impact on disturbance? How many of those, and that's a different number. I think there's a whole separate piece, Sarah, that relates to seasonal exceptions. That's a different thing. Do you agree?
Well, the seasonal exceptions, ones that don't have a prior existing right are gonna get caught up in what we're reporting. That's not tied to disturbance necessarily.
Correct.
But what I'm hearing Joe talk about is something that would not even come to us.
If
I
it
don't
doesn't
think
go to
that
you,
answers your
why would
question.
we report it?
It would come to you only if somebody decided they didn't have an exemption and they wanted to still do the activity, then they would go to you for the exception. And I think the exception does get to minimization. If somebody, they recommend an exception, somebody says, I'm not gonna do that. Well, that's avoidance, it's minimization. They say, oh, we're gonna do less acres.
If an underground coal mine has to go clear an air vent in the middle of the breeding season, they're going to do it. Do we need to report that? That's clearly in the EO, that's a life and human safety issue. It's gonna happen. And they're gonna have an exemption. And it muddies the water. It just completely muddies the water to me.
Exemptions are very muddy, and they could be easily misapplied. So if we keep it to disturbance, it's something we can all wrap our heads around.
And then exceptions that are seasonal are a completely different reporting criteria.
You're not saying don't report it.
No, I'm just saying it's not in this. Okay?
Okay, and obviously, there's a component where if credits are actually provided, our agency would see those. DEQ's got a lot wider range of stuff they do, and the one thing I didn't put in there that came up today is burns, that they do permit burns. Whether that's a remedial, somebody spilled oil and they decide the best way to clean it up is to burn it, or if it's a prescribed burn. they do those kind of experiments. But new source review, that's primarily what air quality, those things would be lumped under. Some of those are under oil and gas, some of them are not. But then surface water permits, which could include a bunch of different things. And then you got large industrial, so that's industrial siting committee, your large projects, landfills, which generally aren't there. Voluntary remediation if you have a release of some contaminant, the way you get some liability protection is to go through the voluntary remediation program, so that they have some, generally they wouldn't have a huge amount of disturbance, maybe centered on an industrial facility. They're out there. Underground injection, we do class 2s, which are oil and gas waste. They do commercial and uranium and so coal sequestration, CCUS stuff, and a few other things. But they do coal bed injection. Also.
They do yours, Julie, correct? Yeah, okay.
WIPDs, that's your discharges, so where you see an outfall, that's what that is. Generally not a lot of disturbance associated with those, but sometimes they'll be associated with reservoirs. Treatment facilities, so there's some commercial wastewater ponds out there, that kind of thing. That would probably be the most applicable. Subdivision permits, do those, which could be applicable. And of course, if mitigation credits were provided for a project, they would collect that data. And we'll note the same, disturbance only on the exceptions. That's really the scope of what we're looking at in this group.
Joe, were the stormwater permits captured under the WIPDs? Is that what you just said?
Yeah, WIPDs would have, they would have different classifications. So one would be stormwater, one would be wastewater.
Because the stormwaters are a big one in terms of
Yeah, so
disturbance.
so everybody understands stormwater permits are the quote hook in roads. So if you disturb over 5 acres in a project, you have a large construction permit. Under 5 acres, I think 1 to 5 acres is a small construction permit, which is basically exactly the same as a large construction permit now. But that's what you have to go through when you're making roads, and some of it's dual, because if you do a pad, if you do a pipeline, if you're going to disturb the surface and you're going to create more than an acre of disturbance, you've got to go through that process. And that the design of the process is to make sure there isn't too much sediment loading in the discharges from that disturbance. But that's where roads get, all your oil field roads, that's where they get hooked into a permit. Nobody, unless a county does, nobody else actually issues a permit that I'm aware of on that road. So it is a large piece, and that's kind of how it gets grouped in there.
Hey, Bob.
Mm-hmm.
I think the interesting thing about this list, if I'm not mistaken, is that there's only one thing in there that is out of the regulatory regime and is within statute, and that's the large industrial facility and the threshold of 220 million. And it seems to me that there could be large industrial facilities that don't meet that capital spending threshold, but do imply a great deal of disturbance on the landscape. And I'm thinking solar here, for example.
They would be regulated. I don't know how solar is regulated.
Very little activity.
County law. So, and the county, this is a state permitting level. So I realize there's maybe some instances like solar where the county's the only one issuing the permit.
Well, and we'll need to factor in how we can get reporting from counties on activities that they regulate, because the one that you have not crossed yet is rural subdivision, which does not necessarily require a subdivision permit.
Yeah, there's a threshold at which you have to go to DEQ for a permit, correct?
35, John?
I think so.
35 acres.
I think it's 35 at the state level. If you're below 35, you have to go and get a subdivision permit, but out above 35, you don't even have to have DEQ or anything. County, maybe.
That's just a zoning deal.
Yeah, and every county is different.
It's just a zone.
So again, the only way you're gonna track that is when that occurs in a lot of counties, is that Nicholas is gonna pick it up in the DDCT. You won't see, there is no permit, there is,
But he would pick it up to way after.
correct, it'd be
If somebody
out.
just takes a 160 and sells 440s off of it. And, yeah, this subdivision.
Until the disturbance occurs, Nicholas will not pick it up.
This subdivision is more like somebody made a bunch of 2-acre lots, put a public water supply
Correct.
system in.
Roads,
did all that.
everything else. Okay, keep going.
I think that's it. That's
Okay.
all.
Bob, I do have one
Yeah.
question, or going back a little bit. We talked about de minimis practices. You still want to report those, and I think there's concern, I guess, for us to look at, reporting for de minimis is kind of saying there's the de minimis, whole point of de minimis is to keep it out of the regulatory framework of disturbance. So I want to be very cautious that we claim disturbances in areas that are de minimis, just like Keith's, anything outside the right of way is reportable. Inside the right of way is de minimis. We're not reporting that. I know the bulk of those are probably those wells and then maybe some ponds and those type of things are de minimis, but
Most de minimis don't have acres of disturbance.
Right.
yeah, and I think the biggest one would be, 10-acre ponds and that's still de minimis in there. So I think I'd like us to be very cautious to report de minimis disturbance because it's de minimis. It's not part of the regulatory framework of this thing.
Yeah,
So
I think in a broad statement, what I was saying is if the de minimis carries a disturbance with it, then it needs to be picked up somewhere in the reporting. But most of them don't. Is there any disturbance associated with them? I mean, it's fences.
well, 10-acre ponds, the water wells, I don't know,
So ponds less than 10 acres for ag purposes. Are
Right.
Well, I can think of, a case where you may be putting in a new cross fence or replacing one where you go through and you lay a right of way that's 5 miles long and 12 feet wide, you're probably gonna exceed that.
And you probably should report that.
Even if it's temporary disturbance?
No.
I'm not sure. I
It's
mean,
something like that.
If they
There's a
beat
disturbance
the
question.
brush, it's de minimis, but if
If
they
you
blade it,
if you run a brush hog over it, I don't think it's is that
not
disturbance?
disturbance.
So you wouldn't lay it in and
That's why it's right instead of blade.
Right. And again, I think, let's not bind ourselves by trying to get to the fine point of some guy who puts in a stock tank and there's an associated half-acre disturbance where the cows drink out of the tank. That's not what we're trying to get to here. And that's the de minimis kind of activity, I think.
I agree. So, as long as that's clear, I guess, that de minimis is kind of,
Yeah, I think we can carve out de minimis activities and then those that, like Larry described, I think that's gonna show up on Nicholas's evaluation anyway.
Yeah. If Nicholas found a 5-acre pond on there, it'd get knocked as disturbance.
I just think one thing missing off your excellent list here is those of us that are mines that are less than that 220 million, we have to have a mine permit, and that is a DEQ function.
Right, so.
And that's where our annual report data would come in to provide the disturbance.
Yeah, somehow I got mines missed on here.
Yeah.
I
Sure I
noticed
did
that.
No offense.
But
Dave,
that'd be our
Esther,
report.
Nick, anything that you got that is missed on these lists that you guys would have? I mean, I think it covers everything you would be required to get. Is that, okay? So,
So we'll take back, we want actual disturbance
yep,
and exemptions only as they relate to disturbance. So small disturbance piece.
We all agreed on that?
I think we did.
Okay,
We'll come back and see.
thank you. Amanda, do you have others?
Other topics?
Yeah.
I think probably just to circle back with the funding discussion, I think we prefaced the data discussion with the idea that there's could be a cost associated with it. As Joe mentioned, the idea here is to take this information back to the state agencies. This is what the SGIT's looking for. What's it gonna take to
Correct.
get that information?
Yeah, this last agenda item is really just an awareness thing. We don't know that number. We don't have that. The cost, this is, as Amanda described it, going back to the agencies and saying, this is what we would like to have. Tell us if you do it, if you can do it, if you can't, or if.
And what's it take to
And
get
what's it take to get there. And Larry's spot on. We're not gonna be going in and asking for FTEs to report this stuff. We're gonna have to figure out what we can do. That's why I think it's important Nicholas can come up and say, okay, under our existing contract, if you want this, this is what we would have to be able to do with that. So,
And
I should warn you that we did discuss more frequent imagery, and imagery is very, very expensive.
I know.
And
I don't
that's
think
not
it's a
something I
small
can
price
control.
tag.
Just as a caveat, I think it's important to recognize the cost of not doing it right, and not being able to defend our position as we go forward. So I'm not meaning to go off on a long tangent here, but I think that if we can't achieve reporting of what we have or have not accomplished with the grouse, we stand in an exposed position to defend our work.
I agree. I guess I'll share my frustration is that it's hard to report numbers when you know the numbers are wrong. And it's particularly difficult in this case when I know we are over-reporting. And, you know, that's the other part. The finer we can get this scale, the better. That's I think what we're trying to figure out how to do. And that should not be an immense burden on any agency to do that.
But my point is that the expense of not doing it right could be very high as well.
Correct.
So getting it right is the balance we need.
And the other piece that I think we all need to think about is that all these agencies are gonna walk up with their weird shaped widgets. We wanna plug them in somewhere.
Yeah.
We can figure out how to get that hub that we all plug into.
That's Nicholas.
Well,
He does it.
weird shaped widgets.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
and with multiple things being tied to the DDCT, I think it's also important to talk about the funding associated with the operations and maintenance
Correct.
of the DDCT tool and what that cost looks like on an annual basis. I think Angie brought this up at the last SGIT meeting, that it's $225,000 a year to do operations and maintenance on the existing DDCT tool. And that funding source does not have great certainty.
So that's kind of the whole point of that last agenda item, is to make people aware of that. That is one of the things that Beth and I are working on. Joe's working on it as well, as to where that funding would come from and how we try and make sure that we have that in a fashion that carries through. Presently, it's come from a couple of different sources, no more than a couple. And that will be one of the things the governor's gonna have to look at when he develops his budget. But I don't have any answers as to where it might come from or how it might change at this point. But I think people do need to be aware it is a significant cost, and it's a service that is provided to industry, to conservation, to everybody. And
Just to elaborate, it will have to come through the governor's budget request. I mean, that is the vehicle to get it to, so that first cut's gonna be with the governor's office. And, I'm sure Bob's gonna be actively involved in those discussions, where it comes from and how much and stuff, but before the legislature. We'll review that in December, but that'll have to be a recommendation. Have a higher probability of getting funded if it comes through the governor's budget, so but we'll see that sometime in December.
And I think,
Legislative side.
I think the big question really that's out there is the funding mechanism. It's not the need. I don't think anybody argues that point, but if you're gonna do it through FNRPA as an example, then the legislature needs to know that they're carving out $250,000 from FNRPA for that purpose. That's just an awareness. If it's coming out of the ESA funds, then we need to know it's coming out of ESA funds. If it's coming out of another item, if he's gonna ask for general fund, that it would go directly to Game and Fish or directly to WIGIS, that needs to be known. That's the part that I think is a transparency piece, and we need to get there at this point. We've been able to cover it for the past few years, but it's at a point where I think it just needs to be, everybody needs to know it's there. It's a cost of doing business, and a lot of people aren't aware of it. Does that help?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anything, that's what I had on the agenda. I think this has been helpful, but we'll go around the table. If people have other things that they want to bring up, we can do that, and then we'll do public comment. So, Jason, you.
I already introduced myself as acting, and I'll just let Jenny touch base a little bit on where we're at with actual implementation in the field in light of the new executive order.
So there were several items in our plan that we were waiting on the executive order to be finished in order to really dig into the implementation. So we're starting to look at the executive order now and see how that affects the implementation. Simple as that.
Except for us.
Darren, you got anything to add?
Nope.
Right?
Two flags, and we can either discuss them, or I would certainly like to discuss them at a future meeting. One of them is, we've talked again about prioritizing outside core. The upcoming lease sale is 48% core. And I just think that bears remembrance and deciding what that means to us as we go forward, especially as we quote that we are prioritizing sale out of at least permitting outside of core. The other piece is, and I've been getting questions on this from researchers and reporters, is on the Lost Creek UR1 effort. And I hear we permitted a doubling of that. I thought we were going to discuss that here at the SGIT, but this is the uranium in situ uranium development. And it seems, I looked at some aerial photographs, and it doesn't look like the minimal impact that we had discussed. That we've not been invited to go look, but from the air it's a little scary. So I would just put that on the table as something we really need to be aware of. That was, for those who weren't around, we used that in developing the DDCT. We permitted it based on a minimal disturbance effort that the company claimed it was making, stated it was making very clearly. And there are complications like, well, I don't even need to get into them right now, but I think it's important that we look at whether or not this is the minimal impact that we projected when we went ahead with it. And I know that they were working with hard rock listing as opposed to mineral, or opposed to liquids and all that, but we did go to a great deal of effort around that development, and we should understand it.
Okay, we can, I can get them to come and give a report or whatever we need to do on that.
Was that Lost Creek?
Do you have any more on that?
I think it's on like around it.
That's so has Lost Creek 2 been gone through the BLM NEPA process?
I don't know.
Or permitting of anything?
I'll need to follow up on that and get a status, and I can bring that back to the group.
Okay, you haven't reviewed it, have you?
We have, Linda's working on it. It's in some stage of NEPA.
I think the proposed action's out there for
Yeah,
NEPA,
but it's
I haven't
not
seen the
permitted.
decision.
Brian said it was permitted. It is, I don't think it's permitted at all. I think we're
We
in
had a
early
lot-
NEPA stages.
We had a Lost Creek expansion, 2 years ago now, and I wasn't sure if that's what, Brian, you were referring to, but yeah, there's a new proposal that's come in and we're working through the process, but where we're at in that, I just don't know.
Okay, I put it down for the next meeting. Okay, Amanda?
I don't have anything
Chris?
additional.
Tyler?
Just to let you know that service is kind of in the process, final stage of identifying who will be the participants on our side for the 2020 conservation assessment. It's led by the states, and I just wanted to reiterate the fact that our role is going to be one of review and pulling things together, but it's going to be the heavy lift by the states for the 2020. So probably within the next week we'll hear who that is. So I'm just going to be working with the folks on that, and we'll leave it at that.
Russ?
Kind of calm right now. We're in the middle of the objection period for the draft record of decision. So that period ends early October.
Okay.
Good.
You good?
Yeah.
Larry?
Yeah, Bob, so one of the things then after reviewing and where our strategy's at, that I think that we need to have some expanded discussion when it comes to mitigation. I'd like to see some more discussion and see how it would fit in if we actually do enhancements. And I get back to the example that you provided is if we get a biological lift through an enhancement, I think that ought to be incorporated into our mitigation strategy and put the fourth leg under that stool. And so when I look at that could be it. And so I want to make clear, I'm not talking about restoration, I'm talking about enhancements. And they may be limited, but I think that's important that we have that discussion to make sure that if that's the best biological thing we can do out there versus just buying credits, let's have that discussion.
Mm-hmm.
But part of that I look at, part of it would be enhancement, potentially part of it is reduced take, and a third part of that may be looking at augmentation. And those things would be potential mitigation strategies that may be much more beneficial than just buying credits. So I'd like to have that discussion if we could. And then the other one is, as we move into this, would look at, try to prioritize the use of mitigation banks for their effectiveness to the affected populations. And I know right off the bat, people are going to say, oh, well, you're going to try to create a captive market, or all the pros and cons with that discussion. But I get back, we've had this discussion for numerous times over the years, is that anything we can do to mitigate the population that's impacted is better mitigation than just going someplace and buying a credit. And so I think that prioritization, how that looks, I have no idea, but I'd like to have that discussion moving forward, especially in light of potential legislation.
Yeah, and I think that at the next meeting, it'd be a November date, that probably will be ripe at that point because that committee will have had a chance to at least lay some things out. And I'm going to request of the chairman that when they get a draft bill, that it actually come back to the SGIT just for input. I think that's appropriate. I don't think they'll object to that.
No.
You could even come in and present it, but I think those topics are ripe for that meeting. So, okay, Joe, you got anything more?
Nope.
Tom?
Nothing.
Right.
I'd just say that I think just yesterday or 2 days ago they announced the Regional Conservation Partnership Program application period is open. With this farm bill, there's more money for that program at the state level and a little more flexibility. So if you're interested in that, I guess just let me know and I can direct you accordingly. Otherwise, I guess we're working on getting ready for the new farm bill, and the interim rules for that should be coming out for public review and those types of things here shortly.
How much money is available for the project?
I couldn't tell you. It's a lot. I think hundreds of millions of dollars.
For the national coordination and then.
Yeah.
Wyoming's been really, really effective in getting RCCP money, and it's something that I think has helped. You've gotten it down there in Little Snake, haven't you?
No, but when they had a statewide pool, we were getting most of that for some other projects.
Yeah, I know we've got them in Sublette County's got a big one. There's one down on the Bear. There are numerous of those. So it's given the experience that Wyoming has getting into that, it's good that there's more money going into it. because they're generally broad-based. It isn't just one project or one type, it's a whole suite of things they can do, from, you know, juniper removal to invasive control, rivers. It all is rolled in together. It's pretty good.
Everything from conservation easements to large river projects in the state, a lot of those are funded through that program.
Yeah.
Do you know if NIFWF is plugged into the RCPP for their sagebrush landscapes program?
They're not tied in with RCPP.
They match.
But yes, they certainly play ball with us, I guess.
They were a big player, Nick, last year in Sublet County on all of the migration stuff that we did, that the trust did. Then we worked with NIFWF, and then that tied to the RCCP, so a big player.
I know we're working with NIFWF in Texas, and they're using the RCPP to funnel a good chunk of money. So.
Yeah. Okay, Dave? Julie? Keith, good? Public comment, anybody have any comment? Yes, Leslie?
I just have a clarification from my presentation that went first. Somebody asked me how many birds need to be on a lek for lek to be there, and I guess 2 string males. We have a whole 2 pages of definitions for leks, and it's a kind of a higher bar to get a lek into the database, but once it's in, maintaining that lek, you only need 1 male to maintain that lek over time. So just a clarification.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Dave?
Yeah, Bob, I just wanted to make a comment on behalf of PAW regarding that conversation we had regarding data.
Regarding what?
The data monitoring.
Yes.
First off, I appreciate your comment that the main issue is actual disturbance. I think we really support that idea. With all due respect, you know, leasing and permits, I don't think are good surrogates for what actually happens. And again, those are the type of numbers that are used to sort of paint dire predictions of what's going to happen. So I think actual disturbance is really the key number there. And I just want to point out an exercise that PAW funded a couple years ago, which I'd like this group to maybe revisit, because I think it's a tool that could help you down the path. So we funded a project called the Lek Mapping Project.
Yes.
Through Nicholas. I know no one can see this, but we created 2,000 maps of the 2-mile buffer, and we had them digitize the actual disturbance in those. So it was non-core and core, and so it would be most of the priority habitat environment, but not all of it, because the areas that were outside the 2-mile buffer, inside core, was not digitized through this effort. But it looked at it in the categories that you mentioned, Brian: oil and gas, mining, power lines, agriculture, fire. And we created these disturbance maps, which are now several years old. Matter of fact, the imagery was 2012. The maps were done 2016, maybe? I can't remember for sure.
That sounds about right.
So we have that baseline disturbance profile for all of these 2-mile buffers. And I believe the best way to get the disturbance moving forward is not all this permit information from all these agencies, but to every couple of years go back to this visual imagery and do that digitization again. And I think it costs us about a little over $100,000 to do this effort. So, Nicholas, I think, said free imagery is available every 3 years. That may not be the frequency that the group wants, but I guess what I'm suggesting is you could every 3 years use existing imagery, pay $100,000 and get a new disturbance profile for most of the state, and that would be actual disturbance. And I guess I encourage the group to look at these maps. Most people don't have them available. I have all 2,000 of them on my computer. And you can, look at the disturbance profile across the whole state. This happens to be the Watsabaw 4 lek, which happens to be one of the important leks up in the northeast part of Wyoming. It shows all the CPM well pads, the roads, and also on the same map is the lek count. So it connects lek count to the disturbance profile. So it's a tool that we were championing as a way to try to look at the data. I'm not saying it's the end all, but I guess I'd request that you guys maybe take a look at it again. I know Nicholas is still working on the finalization of it to where it's available publicly. I know that's something we've had as a goal for quite
Right.
some time, so everybody can pull up each of these light maps. And the reason I think they're powerful is because they would be also a mechanism or a place where one could track exceptions and mitigation on the landscape, all on the same tool. And then the last thing I'll say is the power of this is not so much looking at individual maps, but Nicholas has the ability with the background database to print out maps of Wyoming. If you want to say, show me every 2-mile buffer in Wyoming that has less than 2% disturbance, you can generate that very easily. Or show me a gradient of disturbances across each of these, this set of circles. And so it provides a powerful way to kind of roll up and look at changes, I think, over time. So I would just ask the group to revisit this. We invested quite a bit of money into it. I think, I can only speak for myself now as one company. I would advocate that I would want industry to continue to support this type of tool, because I really agree with Brian. He and I have talked a lot. I think we have to track this over time, because it's the only way we can counter narratives that, oh, you've leased all this acreage or you've got all these permits, you must be causing all this damage to the landscape. And my argument is only with real disturbance data can we have a counter argument to that.
It would also be timely to do that post haste before the 2020 review. So would you get with Nicholas and get me a proposal?
Sure. Yeah, we'd be willing to do that. I know he had mobilized a whole bunch of people last time.
It's really time sensitive to be able to say, this is where we were in 12, this is where we were in 18, or wherever that point is. And I think we can probably find the money to get it done. Yes?
I have a question on that. Is the surface disturbance attributed? Like, can you tell what is it associated with? So you
Yeah.
can classify things.
What is, I mean, you can tell based on kind of a COT report binning, but you can't necessarily tell that it's, whose well it is or that sort of information.
The general
But it's generalized a little bit more than just the DECT, which is pretty binary of disturbance, non-disturbance. This does go, a little
Fire,
bit.
it shows.
Right.
It shows a well pad, it
Has
shows
most-
fire, it shows.
Subdivision.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's,
Power lines, ag,
Yeah.
that's most of the categories you need.
And those maps were distributed with the year's collect data that went out with. So, if there's a lot of interest in saving it, I can move this year's collect data folder, so if you have access to that, and you'll have access to those maps again. They will not be updated with the current count information.
okay.
As Dave mentioned, we are working on a portal to download them. It would go through Game and Fish and NISA and Leslie. As it is like data, we can't just give it out publicly, but we can work with people to make sure that if there's a need, you can get the information.
Yeah, the one thing I'll point out is purposely they were done with there is no data that allows you to locate this on the landscape, right? I mean, you can get there, but it was sort of designed to allow people to look at LEC maps and disturbance profiles and not necessarily know exactly where the LEC was.
Yeah, I think for our purposes though, it would be very, very instructive to be able to make that kind of a report. So if you and Nicholas will just get together and then shoot me an email, I'll try moving that forward as quick as we can. Okay?
And Bob, just to be clear, it'll show the difference between 12 and 18, correct? We can do
Well,
that.
that's what Nicholas would be doing.
That's what I need them to tell me what.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, other comment? Yes?
Just a question for the group. I was just asking Lisa if wildfires go in as a disturbance, and she said yes.
Yes, they do.
So then when do they come off? Because one year it's black and looks like gravel, and the next year it's green.
They come off when they meet the definition of transitional habitat, which is 2 native grasses, 2 forbs, and the ability to transition back to habitat.
And how big of an area? Because I'm just thinking like the Cato fire we had in 2012,
Yeah.
in our backyard, we're looking at 2 fires. Cato fire in 2012, 28,000 acres. Now we got the Deer Creek fire in Buffalo connectivity, 70,000 acres. And it's like, and just in my mind, it's turning green.
Mhm.
Some of it's cheatgrass, so, you know, a lot of cheatgrass, other, you know, might be range from 0 cheatgrass to 80% cheatgrass. So does it all come off at one time?
No.
This part looks okay? And then who's looking? Does that go back? And it kind of gets now into Darren's, a little bit of Darren's backyard, so I don't want to jump too far ahead.
No, go ahead.
But local working group,
I can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I was gonna have you, go ahead.
In the context of if a new project gets proposed in an area where that burn has occurred, and that burn is causing the DDCT for that project to exceed the 5% threshold, one first step that the proponent would want to take is to go out and evaluate that burn in its entirety or the portion that falls within the analysis area and determine whether or not it has returned to suitability. And in some cases, we have found that to be the case in particularly old burns. In other cases, not so much. And there may be a portion of the burn that has returned to some level of suitable habitat, and it can be whittled down a little bit depending on what that looks like. But that's only in the instance where those features get caught up in a DDCT for another proposed project. So I would suspect in a lot of cases, if not most, if a burn happens on the landscape, it may be documented as disturbance, but nobody's gonna go out and reevaluate it on a regular basis unless it's affecting a disturbance threshold.
But they could.
But they
So a
could.
conservation district or NRCS, BLM, anybody could go out and say, okay, we went out and evaluated this, and then notify Waigiscan Game and Fish that is not a disturbance at this point, or actually do the shapefiles aware it's recovered. It's just there's no incentive, or hasn't been an incentive for anybody to do that outside the DDCT process. I will tell you, I did one this year. We had a company come in and they had mapped a burn, which I was going by anyway, and I told Angie and Amanda, I'll go look at it, and the burned area looked better than the adjacent area. So Nicholas took it off as a burn based on a site visit, went out and did photos, did the whole thing, and said, here's what it is. It was a late season burn that went through sagebrush, burned the understory, very, very fast, high winds, and didn't affect it actually improved it. But that's an example of where that would happen and how it happens. But, you know, the conservation district could do that.
I guess I'm just wondering too, if we're maybe missing the boat a little bit, like Brian was mentioning, that this checks and balance of what's been disturbed and what's been restored.
We are over-reporting disturbance. You are correct.
Well, and we're not, we're probably under reporting
Restoration.
on
We're
those,
doing
on
both.
those wildfires. So just, and wonder where we're at with it, and what
Okay.
we should be doing or should be doing.
Jenny?
Isn't there a piece in the EO where a technical team gets involved? I'm not sure. Is that for fires? Is that for? So
On-
evaluate the landscape and put acres back in that.
That's for anything that would try to capture the label of transitional habitat.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to get that in between state, then that technical team needs to verify that the data's been collected and there's 5 years of, I think it's like valid, certifiable, repeatable, something, I don't know what the EO says now, of data, trend data.
It's in Appendix C, I
C,
believe, is
yeah.
where it is. And it's the same process that we're trying to describe to Janelle. Somebody needs to go out and verify that, ground truth that, to be able to say, yeah, this has moved from disturbed into transitional, or from transitional into functional habitat. That process is there.
It seems like some of them would be as easy as you described, when it's very obvious and you can take some photos. I'm guessing something like the Cato fires.
It's going to
require
need
a bit more
transects.
rigor
Oh,
data
absolutely,
collection.
absolutely, yeah.
Our stuff doesn't generally recover from
No,
bonfires.
I know. And with cheatgrass now, it's, you know, even getting it to transitional is going to be a challenge. Other comments? Okay, thank you all for coming, and we'll get a date in November. We'll do a doodle and find out what works for people.